The Unitarian Church in Quincy, Illinois is proud to present the following talk, presented by Megan BOCCARDI, titled Women, Respect, and Respectability. This talk was originally presented Sunday morning, March 14th, 2021 at 10:30 a.m. and was recorded live via Zoom.
And now we'll have Megan's talk, Women, Respect, and Respectability.
Thank you. So when Iris approached me about speaking about Women's History Month and on the topic of respect, my first thoughts on the issue were directed at respect and respectability in the 19th century, which of course is the period of time that I'm most comfortable with. But I wanted to think about these words and what they meant in the 19th century, and then to also think about how we use those words today and if those meanings or the way in which we use respect and respectability have changed or has changed over time, and how the relationship between those words, how that relationship affects women in both time periods. So I wanted to think about how today we look at respect and respectability, and then look at it again, or first look at it in the 19th century, to kind of set up this comparison. So I should note that if you look up the words respect and respectability, but even specifically respect, the 19th century was one of the highest usages of that word. So people use the term respect all the time in the 19th century. And the word usage goes down quite a bit in the 20th century, but it's on the way back up again. Since for the past 20 years or so, we're seeing more use of the term respect in our society again. And I think that's an important thing to note, is that people are becoming, again, more conscious of this idea of respect, particularly in relationship to women and what that means. So I think that's sort of a telling piece of information to know. So like any good student writing a paper, I went to the dictionary, like most students do, to start their papers, to see what how they defined respect, both today and the 19th century. I often have my students do this. I don't ask them to, but this is how they start their papers. And I thought it was funny that I chose to do this, but I wanted to see if the word meaning had changed over time. So in current dictionaries, respect is defined as worthy of high regard, esteem, or worthy of respect for respectability. The Cambridge Dictionary says it's admiration felt or shown for someone or something you believe has good ideas or qualities. It also talks about meaning politeness, honor, care shown towards someone or something that is considered important. In the 19th century dictionaries, the definition was to view or consider with some degree of reverence, to esteem as possessed of real worth, the act of holding in high esteem, to hold as worthy. And so both of these definitions are pretty similar. And I thought that really the definition of the word hadn't changed too much, but maybe some of the usage has, how they use respectable and respectability, and who maybe deserved that, or what that meant for women. So I started with the 19th century, as I said, and I asked the question of how do women in the 19th century gain respect, or recognized as someone who deserved respect or was labeled as respectable. And this was a really big deal, to be labeled as respectable, to be a respectable woman. And the two readings that I selected talk about this, the idea of who deserves to be considered respectable, and how you might be left out of this. So respectability and respect is something that, as a 19th century person, you really want to have. And in order to be a respectable woman, there were certain gender roles of that period that she had to fit. And so a respected woman, or a woman who was deemed respectable, was someone who fit into this mold that was set in the 19th century. That was a very, very well-known well-known and shared with throughout the society for women to be part of. So I want to talk about this idea of what the respectable woman is and those gender roles. Historian Barbara Welter has written on this subject, specifically on what we call the cult of true womanhood in the 19th century, what it means to be an ideal woman, a woman worthy of respect and treated with respect. According to Welter, the gender roles of this period treated men and women as complete and absolute opposites, with almost no human traits that transcended the differences of gender. And if you recall back to my first reading, you could see the treatment of education, how men's education was seen as being this act of discovery and of something that was lauded, but women's education was meant to be moral and centered in the church. So even in any way that you look at it, these women and men had different roles. The cult of true womanhood saw society as functioning in two complementary but mutually distinct spheres of the public and private, work and home, politics and family. Women never managed the outward concerns of a family. They never conducted businesses. They were not supposed to take part in political life. They were not supposed to labor in the fields. And ideally, they were not supposed to make any labor exertions beyond their perceived physical strength. And poverty was not supposed to make an exception to this rule. So even if you were someone whose family could not economically afford you not to work, the ideal role for women was for a woman to stay home. And so automatically, if you were someone who had to work, then you could not be a respectable woman. You fell out of this, out of these gender roles. True womanhood or true women were exclusively in the domestic realm of house, family, and childbearing. Housewifery and childbearing were not considered work. Instead, it was seen as an effortless expression of the woman's feminine nature, which I always think is amusing, as I don't think it's effortless, nor do I think that it's in everyone's woman's nature to be a mother or to be a housewife. Certainly, we all know people who aren't domestic naturally. Actions and leadership were for men, but inspiration and assistance were for women. The home was seen as a haven in the heartless world, a solace from the cruel outside world for men. Of course, we know that this wasn't always the case in terms of women's work and women's role. During the 19th century, there was a separation of home and work that radically altered the way we understand gender roles. So prior to the 19th century, and actually also in the South to some extent, they don't go through this change, but the market revolution of the 19th century successfully separates home and work. So in the idea of the household system, work happened at home. You get up, you take care of your land, you raise your chickens and your cows, and your husband and wife and your children all work together to produce the economic system of the home. And so because it's happening at home and because everyone's working toward a common goal, all of the labor is valued in the same way. A woman's labor making bread, making sausage, making butter is valued as much as her husband's labor out in the field. And so this is all part of this household production. And this is so true that we know that, like the Puritans, for example, recognized how valuable women's labor was, that they gave them a widow's third, right? They guaranteed a third of their husband's estate. So because they said, you have worked so hard to produce this, we should guarantee this for you, at least until basically you die and your estate goes to the son. But this is common in this early sort of period of a moral economy where they're not using wage labor yet, they're producing most of these things in the home, and this is how it operates. However, in the 19th century, particularly in the Northeast, you see this market revolution, right, with this increase in industry. And most people have this choice, right? They can move out to the frontier, like to Illinois, and become a farmer and try to maintain this household level of production. Although out here, we start to see industry impact to farmers too, right? Like John Deere, McCormick technology, it's going to revolutionize the farming industry. But those who stay in the Northeast don't really have the land or the opportunity to continue functioning as a household because of there being too much population. So what is your choice then if you're living in Massachusetts and you don't have enough land to farm and produce on your household? Well, you have to go to work. And whose job is it to go to work? It's a man's job to go to work. And he is then given a wage, unlike before where his work produced and they provided for the family. Now his work doesn't produce anything. He doesn't have a skill necessarily because there's a decline in apprenticeships. You're a worker in a factory and you're given a wage. So men leave the household, it becomes the home, and they go out to work, they earn a wage. Women stay home. That becomes known as the home rather than, right, the home, that's where she is. And immediately the home is devalued because a woman's work at home, which is the same work she's always been doing, she still is likely making bread and butter and taking care of the children and sewing clothes, but she is not earning a wage. And so the same labor that previously was seen as so valued is now no longer seen as valued because she's not earning that wage that a man is out there earning. And at the same time, her labor, she does, because she's a woman's labor is no longer seen as being as difficult or as hard, so it loses value in that way too. So the separation of home and work is really significant. All of this domestic work becomes solely placed on the women. It's seen as having less value because she doesn't earn a wage. And of course, the ideal woman is doing all these things as part of who she is and not for economic success. And if you do happen to have to go work, then you're not able to be an ideal woman. So this is a significant change in this period that leads to part of this cult of true womanhood. As I mentioned, the sort of best and most, the best way to sort of fulfill these ideals of true womanhood is to become a mother. This is the ultimate goal. So if you are young and maybe you work in a factory for a while, you might work there because your father needs extra income, but the goal of this is to ultimately get married and have a family. And in fact, if you don't get married and have a family, if you're a single woman who had to work in a factory, generally a lot of these women worked in textile factories, and this is where the term spinster comes from, women who remain working as spinners, single women, and that of course is unacceptable. So the idea here is to become a mother. And this starts from the idea of Republican motherhood around the time of the revolution, that motherhood becomes a selfless act that's centered on service to others. So women were supposed to train other citizens to be virtuous. It was women's great mission to train immature, weak, and ignorant citizens and creatures to obey the laws of God and man. The ideal woman was also a Christian. The ideal mother was also a Christian. True women functioned at Christ's representation in daily life, and in the domestic environment was supposed to be a sacred territory that women could preserve and protect. A lot of this is pushed forward by Second Great Awakening that's also happening in the mid-19th century. And this is that religious revival that starts in the frontier places like Ohio and Kentucky and spurs lots of new denominations, such as the Mormon Church at this time. And people are looking for ways to deal with all the societal changes, and the Great Awakening helps to solve some of those issues. But the women also become a huge proponent of the Great Awakening and the role of the church for many different reasons, one of which this is an area that they're allowed to participate in. And so women are the majority of converts. They're ones who lead revivals, they participate in religion, and because they're denied secular activities, this is a place where they think they can exert their influence. Evangelical leaders relied on women for support and deeply religious sentiment. And again, as I read earlier, they talked about this as being part of what women's education should be, about God and about morality, and being a good person. This is so driven in these gender roles that they even sort of define the nature of men and women differently. So because of these ideas, women are seen as closer to the divine, and men are tied to a nature that is more animalistic, raw, and created for work in the outside world. So I sum this idea of true woman up with 4 cardinal virtues of true womanhood. A woman was supposed to be pious, right? To be a Christian, to pray, to lead her family and community in Christianity, pure, purities, another one to be both pure of spirit, but also of body. And so a woman was not supposed to enjoy any sort of bodily interactions. She was not supposed to have sex and enjoy it. She's supposed to be pure, both of body and spirit. She's supposed to be submissive to her husband and to men, and to her father, and then to her husband. And then again, that domesticity, which is sort of the key to this. Another quote from this period says, "The perfection of womanhood is wife and mother, the center of family, the magnet that draws men to the domestic altar, that makes him a civilized being, a social Christian. The wife is truly the light of the home." Although the cult of true womanhood was the ideal and guiding ideology for women, in reality, mill workers, slave women, widows, female immigrants all challenged this ideology because women could not adhere to these gender roles in their position or in the way that they lived. The idea of the true woman, that they could live isolated from the outside world and its economic demands, was not a realistic expectation for most women. You would have to have a certain level of economic capability to do so, and have a certain amount of economic success on the part of her husband for her to be this sort of domestic goddess. The women who could not meet these ideal gender roles were not considered worthy of respect or defined as respectable. So in the second reading, I talked about this family that was a respectable family, but the woman says they are not respectable because they are not economically successful. And so respect required some economic standing. It required you to be largely of a certain race, white, Christian, and a married woman in the 19th century. So these ideas of the ideal woman were spread throughout society, both by women, by men, by literature, by magazines, which is one of the reasons I picked Godey's Ladies book. This is a kind of prescriptive literature that was really common in the time period that taught women how to interact with each other. And I want to read you just a really quick other source of prescriptive literature that talks about this idea of respect and holding women to these standards as well. And this is called Old Neighborhoods and New Settlements. And the mother says, "You were right, my daughter, perfectly right. You have won my deepest love, my highest esteem, Mary Leslie. You have won it by your self-control. You have established yourself firmly and permanently in your husband's respect and affection. More than that, you have proved and known the power of faith and prayer. Never forget it, my child." And in that, you can see those gender roles, right? She's respected because of the things she's done that adheres to these 19th century gender roles. So, do these gender roles then apply to respect for today? How far have we come? Do we now universally grant respect to all women? Are certain women treated with more respect than others? Do gender roles still shape how a woman is perceived, deemed respectable? If we don't adhere to gender roles, how are women respected within that? And what are some key indicators that respect is still a gendered issue in the United States? So I decided to just start by Googling women and respect. And the first article that comes up, if you just put women respect in, is teaching boys to respect women. And this is from March 2020, and it's from a more conservative leaning group, the Institute for Family Research. But this is the first thing you find out about respecting women, is teaching boys how to respect women. CNN came up as an article that said sexist rhetoric around the election proves that women still have to fight for respect. And in part of this article, they talk about how Barack Obama, when choosing his choice for Secretary of State, and this article was from 2020, but it references back to Obama. And when he was choosing Secretary of State, one conservative publication wrote that the candidates for Secretary of State were John Kerry, Chuck Hagel, Bill Richardson, plus the ambitious wife of Bill Clinton. And I think just right off the bat, the Respect for Women article is obviously based off of family research and this world of why she deserves respect within the family. And then for talking about Hillary Clinton in this article, I mean, I think we see separate spheres right there, right? She is, she's clearly an interloper into the sphere of men, right? And so much so that they won't even really recognize her name, right? She's referred to as her husband. January 2021, the US cut 140,000 jobs in December. Almost all of those jobs were held by women. That was from the Department of Labor, that when the jobs that were lost were by women, which again talks about the place of women in society, right? Who's supposed to be the one who's working? Who's supposed to earn the wage? It's men. Science magazine talked about women and their roles in science. This is October 2020. There are 3 troubling spots that face women in science. Again, if we think about that first article I read about education of women and where they belong, we know that women are entering into STEM fields more than ever before. But when you talk to women within STEM, they report that they are granted less respect and authority, have to work harder to be successful compared to men. In daily work life, women encounter unprofessional behavior more than men, and women are compensated less than men, which goes back to that 19th century separation of home and work and the wage, right? Who gets the wage? Who deserves that wage for their work? It was men. And we're still seeing that, we're still seeing that today in things like the wage gap. Pew Research in July 2020, and I know I'm going sort of long, but Pew Research in July 2020 said that a century after women gained the right to vote, majority of Americans see work to do still on gender equality. 3 in 10 men say that women's gains have come at the expense of men. And again, I think this is that separate sphere. Rather than seeing them together, they're these sort of countering things, that one can't gain more without the other losing. There was an article about service women in the United States that warrior women face a lack of respect in the service, and this is from 2021. A ESPN article in March 2021, people should respect achievements in women's sport as much as they do in men's sports. They're still not gaining respect. And there were specific articles at different sports, like the WNBA, that talked about how they believe the WNBA isn't popular because it's women, and that the place of athletics is still largely framed as being a male realm. What about women's lives? Do we still treat mothers with respect? Do we see that they are given a higher place of esteem in American culture? Well, we might respect mothers and think that we honor and care them, but the US is just one of 2 countries left in the world as of 2021 that does not guarantee paid maternity leave. Last year, there were fewer women among Fortune 500 companies as executives than men named James, which I thought was unbelievable. Not just fewer women, but fewer women than men named James in the Fortune 500 companies as executives. Maternal mortality rate remains a rampant injustice in the United States. The US has the worst maternal mortality rate of any developed country in the world. And that gets worse as we look at minority groups. Women spend twice as much time as men in unpaid domestic work as of 2020. Only 21% of women are managing board members. Women are underrepresented, and we actually just got worse in this politically. We went down on the scale of political representation, even though I know there have been really important strides recently. We have less women in Congress. We've gotten down to 67th in the world ranking, right by like Mali and someplace else. Anyway, we've never had a woman president, obviously. On a positive note, there is gender parity in things like education, although we know that women's education was always encouraged, particularly when it was seen as used to educate other people. And so women enrollment rates are above 90% in all education levels, and women outnumber men in secondary and tertiary education. But we also know that they're specifically directed towards certain fields that are seen as women's fields. And so, of course, there's other good news, such as our first elected female vice president. And these are a huge step forward. But what I found while working on this topic is that women have made great strides and have been able to achieve a lot since the 19th century. But respect and respectability both still burden women with societal expectations. And respect is hard to come by for women who don't meet those expectations or who somehow sort of break from these expected gender roles. And it can still be used to restrict a woman's behavior and what she can do in life. So I think we need to challenge these limitations and find ways to recognize that all people are worthy of respect, and that respect and respectability should not be a marker of status, but recognition of the dignity and value of every person.